If celestial objects such as planets and stars did what UFOs do, there would be no transference of electrostatic charge throughout the universe, no communication among celestial objects. And if atoms did the same thing as UFOs, there'd be no ability to create a circuit with wire for energy to travel along the wire. UFOs cancel what planets and atoms do. It cancels gravity. It cancels inertia by mechanical vibration along the spin axis of an electromagnetic field immersed in an electrostatic field. So it's that one extra element of mechanical reciprocation along the spin axis of the electromagnetic field immersed in an electrostatic field that neutralizes inertia and neutralizes gravity. Because the purpose of the electrostatic field is to serve as a reference frame. And so UFOs depend on celestial objects to give them a reference frame because it creates a topographic map of the universe as a voltage gradient map upon which to guide their navigation. They can tell where everything is by looking for the stars and the sun and the planets. But a UFO does not have that, does not generate that reference. So you can't use a UFO as a reference in space because it doesn't have one. It's not there. Oh, we see it, you know, oh, there's a UFO. But from a celestial mechanics point of view, it's not there. It's invisible because it has no inertia. It has no gravity. So you can't, it's not there. The universe doesn't notice that it's there. It's a very interesting way of looking at it. But it's understanding the distinction between UFOs and planets and why a planet has gravity and why a UFO does not. And that's the kicker. So the electrostatic field, so a planet and a UFO both do one or two things in common, a cause and an effect. The cause is two counter-rotating electromagnetic fields held closely together. This is similar to what John Bedini did when he would take the north pole of two magnets and tape them together. Or you could do the south poles too. And that creates an electrostatic field or point, an origin to generate or focus in the center, in between those two facing poles that are of like charge. Now there is a, and that and in the but there's one other distinction, I think, between celestial objects, and that is their electrostatic field is minor, while the UFO has to overextend its electrostatic field to a huge degree. To compensate for the mass of nearby objects. Well, that wouldn't be the case, though. Well, maybe the mechanical reciprocation is not enough alone. So it has to have a more intense electrostatic field to compensate. Oh, no, because if you're neutralizing the reference frame of the counter-rotating electromagnetic fields within the reference frame of the electrostatic field, you need a field to reference when you're busy canceling it. Otherwise, the cancellation is not going to amount to anything. Right. So in a loosey-goose way, yeah, you're doing it to compensate for the difference in mass, but not exactly. It's just that you're doing something heavy-duty. You're neutralizing inertia, and so you have to have a very powerful electrostatic field to compensate, yes, for larger objects nearby, such as a planet that the UFO might be hovering around or moving around. Okay, so that part I got right. Now, the problem I still have, though, is counter-rotating does not make sense for a celestial object. It makes sense for a UFO, but it does not make sense, and it does not make sense. See, I'm going on a quote. See, this is not in the patent. So I'm going on a quote that somebody stated in front of Charlie Lutz, and Charlie Lutz smiled and gave his silent approval. He didn't say anything. So I'm going, and the quote was slightly different. It was 2 counter-rotating disks, the person claimed was how UFOs fly or, do their thing. So I'm assuming that, unlike the patent that states it's a rotating magnetic field that is being mechanically reciprocated along its spin axis, I add the electrostatic field, and then I wonder how is it generated? Well, it could be generated if you have 2 counter-rotating magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields. Then the electrostatic field would get generated automatically as a consequence. So actually, when I think about it, if the 2 counter-rotating fields mechanically reciprocate, the electrostatic field moves along with the electromagnetic field. So it's not creating a reference frame. Not at all. So what is it doing? Oh my God, it's neutralizing the transference of electrostatic charge. And thus it's able to build it up. So not only does it need a strong electrostatic field to compensate for the difference in mass between itself and larger objects nearby, but what was the thought? Oh, shoot. It has to cancel the transference of electrostatic charge among celestial objects, which includes atoms, because it's a step-down procedure of appropriation in which the electrostatic charge continues to get subdivided. The smaller and smaller you go among celestial objects, going from galaxies to stars to planets to atoms. At least that's what we know. Obviously, the magnitude of scale in our universe is probably not bounded. So there's probably no upper boundary, no lower boundary, but assuming that a galaxy is the upper boundary and an atom is the lower boundary, to the similarity of structure in which you have a hollow sphere with energy at the center. And that's the structure of atoms, that's the structure of planets and stars and the hubs of galaxies, the hubs of spiral galaxies and the entirety of ellipsoidal galaxies. That's the geometry, the structure of those objects. But they don't mechanically reciprocate along their electromagnetic spin axis. And thus they're able to transfer electrostatic charge from the center of one celestial object to the next one down the line in size, and subdivide their charges among the smaller sized objects in creation. And thus, thus I came up with this idea of limitless magnitude of the scale of space, because you have to, because where's the energy going to go? It has to keep going somewhere. And so it's an endless flow in one direction, from the larger celestial objects to smaller and smaller and smaller atomic and subatomic, all the way down to infinite smallness, coming from infinite largeness. And thus, you can't say where does energy come from in that case, in that hypothesis, because it's not a question of where, it's a question of when. It comes out of time. So energy can come out of any location in space because of the manipulation of time. Anyway, I've already covered that with reactants, videos and whatnot. To take this line of reasoning a little bit further, the body of water that moves past the metallic conduit attached to one end of the various metallic pipes, the other end of which is pointed at the UFO, creating the electrostatic field in the situation of Wilhelm Reich's just subsequent to his arrest, when he brought down a UFO by neutralizing the clouds surrounding the UFO that was hiding the UFO, generated by the electrostatic field of the UFO. The mass of water that becomes ionized and moves past the grounding point of his circuit, Wilhelm's circuit, amounts to becoming greater than the mass that the UFO is trying to neutralize. Because the UFO is only trying to neutralize its own mass. It's not trying to neutralize the mass of the Earth. Because it only has to worry about its own mass and the occupants inside and whatnot. And so the mass of water that Wilhelm Reich's cloudbuster is grounding itself to, which includes the Earth underneath when I think about it. Oh my God, that's a humongous amount of mass. So yeah, duh. And just the water alone, though, if that's all we can consider, is greater than the mass of the UFO, greater than the hypothetical mass that the UFO takes as a standard for its operations, which is something greater than its own mass. So for safety's sake and for the maneuverability and speed, it has to neutralize a mass greater than itself, but less than the objects it has to negotiate around, the celestial objects it has to negotiate around, such as planets and stars and galaxies. So it chooses a mass greater than itself, yet the water that is becoming ionized, grounding out the electrostatic field of the UFO, is greater than that mathematical fictional mass that the UFO is using as its standard to generate its to use as its reference for how to navigate properly. That's why that works. Because water is very massive and it's constantly being replaced by more water molecules, so that eventually becomes a large amount of mass, and that's why all of the electrostatic field that the UFO generates can be neutralized eventually by gradual degree, itty bitty bit at a time. Pretty cool. How about that? Okay, this was the last thing I had to add that I figured out that was bugging me. Why does a planet have an electromagnetic field if you have two counter-rotating electromagnetic fields in the center of the planet, in the center of a hollow planet? And why would you have a magnetic dipole possibility in a ferromagnetic material, for that matter, let alone whether or not the dipoles are aligned to create a permanent magnet? The situation is interesting because how much do you really need to create a magnetic field? Not a whole lot. So actually what's going on is the magnetic field of the Earth could have been greater if it only had one spinning magnetic field, but it doesn't. It has two. They're counter-rotating, and one is slightly more powerful than the other. And the net difference is the magnetic field that we end up with. Okay? So in a UFO, they may vary it depending on, which one is dominating the other, depending on whether or not they want to go upwards or downwards and submerge themselves underwater, and now they have to counteract the buoyancy of water to go underwater. But if they're up above water, they have to counteract the gravity of the planet. So they may change the strength of one rotating magnetic field versus the other, but they have to be counter-rotating in order to create stability of the craft to prevent the craft from flipping over. Because if you have only one rotating field, anytime an object passes nearby, like any compass needle, it's going to want to flip and keep pointing at the passing object. We can't have that. We have to have stability. So that's why you have to have two counter-rotating fields, and that's why you get any magnetic field coming out of it, is because one is larger than the other. And you always will have one larger than the other, because you're either trying to create repulsion when you're hovering to neutralize, if you're above a gravitational object such as the Earth, or submersion, in which you want a greater field to attract yourself to the center of the Earth so that you can go underwater and counteract the buoyancy of the craft, the air inside the craft, buoying it towards the surface. You want to fight that. Now, you also have the mechanical reciprocation along the spin axis of the two counter-rotating fields also assisting. But no one factor is enough to do the job. That's why you need multiple factors to effectively give the UFO craft mobility to the extent that it has, which is quite phenomenal, you know. Right angle turns at 4,000 miles an hour, stop on a dime, accelerate immediately. You know, this is phenomenal, but it's multiple factors creating these benefits, which are in the extreme. So now I figured it out. All the little factors. And the clue this morning to help me was, I realized, and somebody confirmed it, the G-force constant is different for atomic matter than it is for celestial objects. How can that be? And so the reason is that I didn't state, but I alluded to it, so I might as well state it now. In order for a planet to function, it has to have a G-force greater than the matter that it is constructed of to overcome that in order to have its own construct at all. Otherwise, the fragments would fall apart. A planet is a soap bubble, basically. And instead of the pressure of the gas inside a soap bubble, we have other forces at work to buoy the surface of the planet outward from its center and keep them in place. But it's very fragile. It could be disturbed at any time. So, but it still has to be held in place to some degree, and so the force at the center of a hollow planet has to be greater than the force at the center of the iron and silica atoms that composes the crust of the Earth, let's say. And it has to be less than the force at the center of the hollow sun at the center of our solar system, which also in turn has to be less. And you see how I'm going upwards? That's exactly how electrostatic charge gets appropriated, subdivided among various size objects in creation. It distributes charge by way of subdivision of electrostatic charge. So it's totally in keeping with that. But see, I had to figure that part out. So I had to figure out all these little details to figure out the big picture of gravity. Let's face it, nobody understands it because it is complicated. It is rocket science in a theoretical sense, because there's so many of these factors that have to interact. But it's this patent, this U.S. patent, that is the beginning of understanding, only the beginning, of understanding how gravity actually works. Okay? I better add this thought before I forget. What is the rate of reciprocation relative to the rate of rotation of the electromagnetic field in this situation? I used to think it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but it may not be. I'm guessing it has to equal a quarter wave function, so it has to be a quarter phase, so it has to be 4 times faster than the rotation rate of the electromagnetic field. Whatever that amounts to, since they're counter-rotating. Ooh, good point. Well, the current running through that, you know, device creating those fields must be running at a certain frequency, or maybe it's pulsed. Maybe it's not AC, maybe it's pulsed AC or pulsed DC, or, you know, something is dominating it in terms of pitch, and so the reciprocation has to be 4 times greater. That would be my guess, but it could be something else, some other factor other than 4. But it's probably going to be a factor. It's probably not going to be 1-to-1. That's my guess, because it has to destroy the rotation of the electromagnetic field, and the rotation plane, the rotation field is a plane, a 2-dimensional plane. So you don't destroy it holistically. You destroy it by dividing it up like you divide up the wedges of a pie. You cut a pie into sections. So it's going to have to be a multiple. That's my guess.